He was supposed to guide others toward faith. I was just a volunteer trying to find my place in the world. But what began in silence, beneath old church lights, turned into a bond neither of us expected. 5 years passed before we could even name what it was. This is a story about longing, restraint, and the quiet kind of love that refuses to fade. When Theo Sullivan stepped off the bus and into the hazy quiet of his hometown, it felt like time had folded in on itself. The town hadn't changed much. Same narrow streets, same brick storefronts with hand-painted signs, same rustling of old trees against window panes. It was the kind of place that held on to things. Sometimes that was comforting. Other times, it made the air feel too full. He hadn't meant to come back. After 4 years at university and a brief, chaotic attempt at city life, Theo had imagined his return would be years down the road, if ever. But life had a way of tightening its grip when least expected. So, he came back, quietly, without fanfare, slipping back into the rhythm of a place that remembered him too well. His parents had moved away the previous spring, and the house he grew up in was now someone else's. He rented a small room above the florist shop where he used to buy cheap bouquets for school plays. It was enough, barely, but he didn't need much. Most days he spent at the library, reading aimlessly or walking familiar roads just to feel the texture of memory underfoot. It was a bulletin board flyer that pulled him back toward the church. The community center needed volunteers for summer programs, tutoring, event coordination, organizing the food drive. Theo didn't think much of it at first. He needed something to fill the time, and giving back to the town felt easier than figuring out what came next. The church sat on a hill at the edge of town, its white steeple rising through a cluster of evergreens. He hadn't been inside since high school. Back then, it was mostly out of obligation, a mixture of routine and tradition. But there had always been something about that space. Not the sermons or the doctrine, but the quiet corners, the high ceilings, the stillness. He remembered Father Nathaniel Hart long before he saw him again. Tall, composed, the kind of man who made silence feel intentional. Theo had always been a little in awe of him, not in the way children admired authority, but something gentler. Nathaniel had spoken with patience, listened without rushing to fill the air, and had once taken Theo aside after service just to ask how he was doing. No agenda, no lesson, just a pause in the noise. Theo saw him again on his second day at the community center. Nathaniel stood in the hallway outside the supply room, sorting papers with quiet focus. He looked older, of course. A few more lines near his eyes, a touch of gray in the beard. But there was something unchanged too, something steady. Their exchange was brief. A nod, a handshake, a faint glimmer of recognition in Nathaniel's expression that flickered like candlelight. Warm, subtle, gone too quickly. In the weeks that followed, Theo settled into his role. He helped sort donations, manage schedules, led a few reading sessions for kids. The work was grounding. It gave his days structure. Occasionally, Nathaniel would pass through, never in a rush, always with that same quiet attentiveness. Their paths crossed more often than not. Conversations began simply. Logistics, planning, event reminders. But slowly, they stretched into something else. Nathaniel would linger a little longer in the doorway. Theo found himself staying later just to organize one more box. They spoke about books once. Theo mentioned something he'd read, and Nathaniel responded with a reflection that surprised him with its depth. Another time, they stood in silence in the small kitchen off the main hall, drinking coffee that had long gone cold. It wasn't uncomfortable, just still. Theo wasn't sure when he started noticing the spaces between words, the moments when their eyes met and neither of them looked away too quickly. It wasn't dramatic. There was no pull, no obvious signal, just a soft tension that hummed beneath the surface, like the low note of a song that stayed in the background. One evening, after the last group had gone home and the building was mostly dark, Theo sat alone in the main hall, his back against a pew. He stared up at the stained glass window above the altar, watching how the fading light touched the colors, making them shift and glow. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts get loud. He heard footsteps approach, but didn't turn. He knew it was Nathaniel. The man didn't speak. He sat a few feet away, hands resting on his knees, matching Theo's silence. It stayed like that for a long time. Something passed between them, not through words, but through presence. A mutual understanding that neither dared name. The world around them remained still, but inside, something had shifted. Theo didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, replaying every small interaction, every glance, every almost. His heart beat, not with fear, but with the aching awareness of a connection he couldn't explain. It was subtle. It was slow, but something had begun, and he knew it wouldn't stay buried forever. There was something about late summer afternoons that made everything feel a little suspended, like time itself was holding its breath. The heat softened the edges of the day, and even the sounds seemed to quiet down. That was the kind of day. It was when Theo arrived early to help set up for the youth book fair at the community center. The parking lot was nearly empty, the sky a pale, endless blue. Inside, the building was cool and still. He moved through the familiar halls, carrying boxes of used books into the multi-purpose room, arranging them into neat stacks along the tables. It was simple work, but he welcomed it. His hands were busy, and his mind for once was not. Nathaniel arrived about 30 minutes later, carrying a thermos and 2 mismatched mugs. He placed them gently on the edge of the table where Theo was sorting through mystery novels. Without a word, he poured them each a cup of lukewarm coffee, and they stood side by side, sipping in silence. There had been more of these moments lately. Shared silences, comfortable pauses, words that hovered but never landed. Theo didn't know how to describe it, even to himself. There was no script for this, no label he could assign to the slow, quiet rhythm they'd fallen into. It wasn't friendship, at least not just that, and it certainly wasn't something they could name aloud. Nathaniel spoke occasionally about his work, not sermons, but the people he saw, the families struggling, the young adults unsure of their paths, the quiet grief that sometimes walked through the doors without saying a word. Theo listened. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try to interpret. He just absorbed. Sometimes Nathaniel asked about Theo's life in the city, about university, about why he really came back. Theo didn't always have clear answers, but the questions never felt invasive. They felt like openings. That afternoon, they finished setting up before anyone else arrived. The room looked warm and inviting, sunlight filtering through the tall windows, casting long rectangles across the worn wooden floor. Theo sat down on the edge of the table, looking out at the room they had built together, even if just for a day. Nathaniel stood nearby, sipping his coffee, his gaze distant. "You seem more at ease here than when you first returned," he said eventually, voice low. The comment wasn't meant to pry. It was just an observation, offered gently. Theo nodded, unsure of what to say in return. He was more at ease in some ways, but in others, he felt more exposed than ever. He glanced over at Nathaniel. The man's face was unreadable, but not cold. There was always something held in reserve behind his eyes. Not secrets, necessarily, more like weight, as if he carried things no one else saw. There had been a moment the week before. After a planning meeting, they had both lingered near the back doors as the last of the volunteers left. The light had fallen across Nathaniel's face in such a way that Theo had almost reached out, caught in the stillness of it. He hadn't, of course, but the urge had been real, and it had stayed with him. That moment had returned to Theo often, in quiet hours when the rest of the world receded. It played in his mind not as fantasy, but as a memory he didn't know what to do with. He sometimes wondered if Nathaniel felt it too. That low hum of awareness that passed between them in brief glances and unspoken pauses. If he noticed the way the world seemed to slow down in those moments. If he also lay awake some nights, turning over questions he couldn't voice. The book fair brought in more people than expected. Families with young children, teenagers browsing through stacks of poetry, older couples flipping through cookbooks. Theo moved through the crowd with practiced ease, helping where needed, offering quiet suggestions. Nathaniel stayed near the entrance, welcoming people with his usual calm presence. But every so often, Theo would catch him looking his way. Not lingering, not overt, just present. By late afternoon, the crowd thinned. The tables were lighter, many of the books claimed and carried away. Volunteers began to pack up. Laughter echoed faintly from the hallway as the last few visitors left. Theo stayed behind to finish clearing the tables. Nathaniel joined him in the quiet. They worked in parallel again, hands moving in silence. When the last box was taped shut, Theo leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Nathaniel stood nearby, his hands in his pockets. The space between them felt charged, like static before a storm. Theo spoke first, not a question, not a confession. Just a truth he didn't want to keep inside anymore. Sometimes it feels easier to breathe when you're around. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He just looked at Theo, really looked, and something passed between them that didn't need translation. No lines were crossed. No declarations were made. But in that moment, something deepened. Quietly, unmistakably. When they finally parted ways that evening, the hallway lights flickering above them, Theo walked out into the warm twilight, feeling both weightless and impossibly grounded. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out. Even as the days grew shorter and the wind began to carry the early notes of autumn, there was a stillness that lingered around the church grounds. Theo noticed it most in the early evenings, how the light pooled differently in corners, how the breeze picked up just enough to stir the edges of papers left near open windows. The transition of seasons made everything feel more fragile, more exposed. He found himself lingering at the community center after hours, long after the volunteers had gone home. Sometimes he stayed to finish small tasks no one had asked him to do, organizing supply closets, wiping down counters that were already clean, shelving donated books in the makeshift reading room. Other times, he simply sat in the back room with the lights dimmed, letting the quiet settle around him like a blanket. Nathaniel often remained too, though never by arrangement. It just seemed to happen that way. They moved in separate orbits during the day, always maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But when the building emptied out and the world softened, they would find themselves occupying the same space, quietly, steadily. Their conversations had deepened in subtle ways. Less about logistics now, more reflective. Nathaniel would speak about his past, not in confessions, but in carefully chosen memories. Theo listened closely, piecing together a fuller picture of the man who had once stood at the front of the church with unshakable conviction. There were pauses between his words that said as much as the words themselves. Theo spoke too, though cautiously, about leaving the city, about the sense of disconnection that had followed him like a shadow. He didn't say everything, but he said enough, and Nathaniel never pressed. There was comfort in that, knowing that silence would always be met with respect. One particular evening remained with Theo long after it ended. The sky outside had already turned dark, and the hum of distant crickets floated in through the slightly cracked windows. The main hallway was lit only by the soft, overhead glow, the kind that blurred sharp edges. Theo had been gathering leftover pamphlets when he heard Nathaniel's footsteps approaching. Without speaking, the older man joined him, standing just close enough that their arms nearly brushed. It was such a small thing, that almost contact, and yet it sent a quiet ripple through Theo's chest. They didn't speak at first. The silence was its own kind of language. Eventually, Nathaniel sat on the edge of the low stage at the front of the hall. Theo joined him. They looked out over the empty chairs, rows upon rows lined up for Sunday service. The space felt sacred, but not in the way sermons made it feel. Sacred in its stillness, in its restraint. "Do you ever wonder," Nathaniel said finally, his voice barely more than a breath, "what it means when something feels right, even when it doesn't fit into the life you thought you were supposed to live?" Theo didn't answer right away. His heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from recognition. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was layered, raw beneath its careful delivery. He thought of all the moments that had passed between them, like slow-burning candles. The way Nathaniel's eyes sometimes lingered just a second too long. The way Theo's body seemed to know when Nathaniel entered a room, as if something inside him shifted to make space for the presence. "I think," Theo said slowly, "some truths don't fit into boxes. Maybe we're not meant to force them to." It was all he could manage, but it was enough. Nathaniel didn't reply. He only nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant point. But Theo saw it. The slight loosening in his posture, the exhale that sounded just a bit less burdened. They sat there until the overhead lights flickered slightly, reminding them of the hour. When they stood, Nathaniel's hand brushed against Theo's. Not deliberate, not avoided either. The briefest contact, but the electricity of it stayed with Theo long after they said goodnight. That night, Theo couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling of his small, rented room, every sense tuned to the memory of that moment. It wasn't about romance, not exactly. It wasn't even about desire, at least not in a physical sense. It was about something deeper, recognition, longing, the quiet ache of finding a kindred spirit in a place where words failed. The next day, things continued as usual. They didn't mention the moment. They didn't need to, but their silences held more. Their glances carried weight. The world around them continued spinning, but for Theo, everything had shifted. He didn't know where it would lead. He wasn't even sure he was ready to find out. But for the first time in years, he felt something real. Something unspoken but undeniable. And that was enough to keep walking toward it. The rhythm of autumn settled into the town like a soft hush. Leaves turned brittle and golden, collecting in slow-moving drifts along the sidewalks. Mornings arrived colder now, wrapped in mist. Theo found himself walking slower, drawn into the textures of the season, the way light filtered differently through bare branches, the quiet that followed him like a shadow. His time at the community center had become more than routine. It had become something steady, a quiet center in the soft blur of returning. But he felt the shift coming. It wasn't abrupt or dramatic. It moved like the changing wind, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Nathaniel had become more distant. Not unkind, not avoidant, but his presence had changed. He still showed up, still offered small smiles and warm nods. But the pauses had grown longer. The conversations, less frequent. There was something held back now, more than before. Theo didn't ask. Part of him didn't want the answer. Another part feared he already knew it. One evening, after a small volunteer dinner, Theo lingered behind to help clean. The others filtered out in waves. Laughter and car engines fading into the night. Nathaniel stayed until the last folding chair was stacked, then paused in the doorway of the supply room. He looked tired, not physically, but in a way that settled behind the eyes. A kind of weariness that came from carrying something too long. "I've asked for time away," he said, his voice low. "A sabbatical." The words fell with gentle finality, like the last leaf from a branch. Theo nodded, though his chest tightened. It wasn't a surprise. Not really. But hearing it aloud gave it weight. Nathaniel continued, his gaze not quite meeting Theo's. "It's just a few months. Some space to think. To recenter." There was no mention of what had passed between them. The glances, the quiet proximity, the soft unfolding that had tethered them in silence. But it lived in the air between them, undeniable and unfinished. Theo swallowed the rush of words that surged toward his lips. He wanted to ask where this left them, if this was an ending or just a pause. But he said nothing. Not yet. Instead, he nodded again. "Okay." Nathaniel stepped closer, his movements careful, measured. For a moment, Theo thought he might say something more. But then he simply placed a folded sheet of paper on the counter between them, a note, maybe, or just something he needed to leave behind. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Theo saw the full weight of everything Nathaniel had been holding, the conflict, the restraint, the impossible balance between belief and feeling. "Take care of yourself," Nathaniel said, and then he was gone. The days that followed moved strangely, like time had slipped out of step. Theo kept going to the center, kept helping, but the space felt emptier. He missed the rhythm of Nathaniel's presence, the calm that came with his quiet way of inhabiting a room. The note stayed folded on Theo's nightstand for nearly a week before he opened it. The handwriting was familiar, steady, careful. The message was brief, but every line pulsed with restraint. He had written of gratitude, of quiet admiration, of lines blurred and unspoken. There were no declarations, no apologies, just acknowledgement. and one final line that Theo read over and over again. I hope, wherever this leads you, it leads you toward peace. Theo didn't cry. He didn't crumble. But something in him softened. A quiet loosening of something he hadn't known was clenched. Autumn deepened. He kept walking the streets he knew, kept moving through days that felt quieter now. But the silence no longer felt hollow. It felt like waiting, like breath held just a little longer. He wrote back once, not a letter, just a short message left with Isabel, who managed the administrative side of the church. Sometimes the path to peace begins with being honest about what we feel. I'm learning that. Thank you for the space to begin. He didn't know if Nathaniel would write again. He didn't expect it, but he carried the stillness they'd shared like a compass. Not pointing to a destination, but a direction. And for now, that was enough. 5 years passed quietly. The town didn't change much. It never did. Seasons cycled through the same colors, the same rituals. Leaves still turned to gold and curled into the streets each autumn. The library remained a place where time felt slower. The church still stood on the hill, white steeple cutting the sky like a bookmark pressed between pages. Theo Sullivan had moved away a few years earlier. Not abruptly, but with the kind of slow departure that came after a season of silent growth. He'd taken a job at a small publishing house 2 states north, editing manuscripts, and sometimes walking through used bookstores during lunch breaks. Life was quieter there, but not empty. He had found rhythm, found solitude that didn't echo. The letter came in early spring, folded neatly in a plain envelope. It bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. He had stared at it for almost an hour before opening it. Nathaniel Hart had written only a page. The words were careful, thoughtful, honest. There was no urgency in the letter. No request, just a reflection. He had completed his sabbatical and quietly stepped away from formal ministry. He'd taken a position at a retreat center, facilitating small gatherings, helping others navigate grief and change. There was no direct mention of the past, but between every line was the echo of their shared silences. A month later, Theo found himself driving south. Not out of compulsion, not to chase something unfinished, but because the years had softened the sharp edges, and what remained was a desire to stand in the same space again. Not as a question, but as a possibility. The retreat center was nestled among pine trees, far from any main road. It wasn't grand. A cluster of cabins, a central hall, a garden that looked both tended and wild. Theo arrived on a cool afternoon. The air smelled of cedar and rain. Nathaniel met him near the entrance. His hair was more silver now, the lines around his eyes deeper. But his presence, steady, unforced, was the same. There were no dramatic moments, no embraces, just a long, quiet look. Recognition layered with time. They walked the grounds together that evening. No plan, no script, just movement. Theo spoke a little about his life, the city, the work, the quiet hours spent reading. Nathaniel listened, nodding occasionally, adding small reflections about the people he met, the stories they carried. As dusk settled, they sat beneath a wooden trellis covered in vines. The air cooled, and the night wrapped around them like an old memory. For a long time, they didn't speak. And then, almost without thinking, Theo said, "I've carried our silences with me." Nathaniel looked out toward the trees, his voice barely above the wind. Me too. There was nothing else to say, not in that moment. Everything had already been spoken, just not aloud. They stayed that way as the stars came out, not reaching for each other, not rushing forward, just sharing the same space, breathing the same air, letting time reshape what had once been fragile into something whole. The next morning, Theo helped in the garden. He stayed a few days. They didn't define anything, didn't assign roles or futures, but they continued walking, talking, sharing meals. Sometimes their hands brushed when they passed books or mugs of tea. Sometimes their laughter caught them both by surprise. It was simple, it was honest, and it was enough. Before Theo left, he stood with Nathaniel on the porch of the main hall. Morning light filtered through the trees. There was no goodbye, just a quiet pause. Nathaniel handed him a folded note, the handwriting instantly familiar. Theo didn't open it until he reached the highway. Inside, only one line. There is no need to name what we already know. He smiled. For the first time in years, the silence inside him felt like home.